Hello, I'm Bret. This is my show. We're live on the internet. I'm excited today because we're going to nerd out for a while. We're going to spend some time. With my friend Kyle. We're going to get all into it. But in case you didn't know, real quick, this is a live show. Happens every Thursday. If you're new to this, come back on Thursdays and you'll see guests talking about containers and cloud native DevOps and all that stuff. And we turned into a podcast. This actually gets edited down. Thanks, Christy, my editor. Turns this into a podcast. If you didn't know, you can listen on any podcast player, DevOps and Docker Talk. Just search my name or that title. We've got all sorts of great episodes. Recently, we just released the K2D Portainer show, which if you didn't know about that, that's a really interesting project that allows you to use the Kubernetes API on top of Docker without needing a Kubernetes control plane. We'll see if where they take that and whether it's adopted by a lot of people. That's a fun one. Chainguard was on, which we're going to be talking about more again today, talking about secure images. We had AWS Finch on recently this year with my friend Phil talking about yet another way to run your containers locally for dev and test. And so, so check that out. That's at bretfisher.com, like over there on that side. And then above me is the Discord server where you can come and check out and hang out after and during the show. If you didn't know that, that is on Discord. And that's where we hang out now. I'm not going to bring it up today because I don't feel like it, but join right above, discord.gg/devops. I was so excited to get that handle. So there's like 19,000 of us in there chatting all the time, and it's just a great little community. So we also have monthly meetups there where you can join, and we're all on sort of a Zoom call together, but in Discord, and we hang out, talk about our projects and whatnot. So you can join the high fivers there, check that stuff out. That's a membership thing. And then lastly, we have a newsletter. So each week, most weeks, I put out a newsletter and I talk about who's going to be on the show, what we just did on the show, what we released. Something new every week in my little corner of the internet. So you can join that. You can watch our YouTube videos from there. By the way, we're going to start, we're prepping and been working for months now. We're going to start releasing edited versions of this show as videos back on YouTube because YouTube is now the home of podcasts. Who knew? So instead of having lame audio-only podcasts, we're going to also have the video versions on YouTube. So you can watch this without all of my ums and my boring intro like this part, and you can just focus on my guests who are the smart people. And speaking of guests, let's get into it. This is Kyle. Hi, Kyle.
Hey, Bret. Hey, everybody. I'm Kyle, or Q, or the DockerSlim guy.
The DockerSlim guy. I like your labels recently. I noticed you sort of branded yourself. I don't know when you did that, but on Twitter and LinkedIn, you say the DockerSlim guy, which ironically, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the name change, get all into that. Mm-hmm. So I knew you. And so for those of you catching up, Kyle, have you been on the show before? I don't think you have actually.
But we talked a lot.
Yeah, we've talked a lot. We've talked at conferences for years now. And we had Slim AI, a company that you founded. I don't know what year was that founded?
2020.
2020. I was going to guess 2019. 2020, and we had that crew on the show a couple of years ago talking about DockerSlim, but specifically about Slim AI. That company has decided to close its doors, but you're still doing DockerSlim, adding new features. We're going to get into all that today. I'm excited to talk about debug. We're going to mention a little bit on AI. I'm kind of giving spoilers to everybody. And then we're going to talk about something new you're starting.
AI.
Yeah. We've got a whole lot to cover. So let's back up for a second and talk about, like, you got into DockerSlim and when was that project? When did you start that project?
So it was a while ago, and it was because of a hackathon Docker did back then. They used to do these global hackathons.
Yeah.
I had the idea for a while, and I experimented with it here and there, but actually with AWS, the idea of an application-centric approach where you're capturing the information about the application, and then you automatically do stuff with that information.
Yeah.
And then during the hackathon, I thought, well, why not use this information to reassemble the containers to make them better, smaller, and more secure? And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the rest is history. DockerSlim got started. The project took off. You got a whole bunch of stars on GitHub. It became a useful tool for inspecting and not just looking into containers, but also actually making new images from them. And I'm sure we'll get into some demos later. We'll talk about that. And
exactly. And we're getting to 1 million downloads. Getting close to 1 million downloads.
Nice. That's a lot. I mean, we all talk about container images in the billions, but like when you're a small project running an open source, just to get that many downloads, that's pretty impressive. We have been talking about shrinking our images or using like smaller images. Alpine gets thrown out a lot, but I feel like we've been talking about this for 6 years plus. Like it's been a while. It's not a new thing, but there's still, I feel like still a large portion of container users that feel like it's either they don't know how to shrink their images or reduce the image size. They don't know how to get rid of all the CVEs in their images when they use a scanner for the first time, and they kind of freak out. And then they often will think that the only way they can shrink their images down is to switch to a new distro. Like they have to go from
Yep.
Debian to Alpine or something like that in order
Or
to
build
make it all work, which
scratch
is a lot of
images.
work.
Or
What's
build
that?
scratch images, which
Or build
can
scratch
be
images. Yeah.
doable in some cases for some runtimes, Go, for example,
Right.
but trickier for others. But even with Go, actually, there are quite a few gotchas. We can get into those, but yeah, there's more
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah, for sure. And for those of you watching live in chat, we're looking for your questions because that's why we do this live. So if you have questions
Mhm.
around shrinking your images, reducing CVEs, debugging them, inspecting them, this is the show for that. So throw your questions in now. We're going to get to those as a part of the show. But what was like Docker Slim's first feature? Like, what was the first reason that you sort of created it? Was it actually shrinking the image down, or was it inspecting it, or what was the original
Exactly.
focus?
Building minimal container images. That was the use case. And, you mentioned that it's not a new concept. People have been talking about that for a while, have been trying to do that for a while, but let's just be honest. It hasn't been widely adopted yet. And there's a
Yeah.
number of reasons. One of the reasons is because it sounds easier than it is. It's easier said than done. And it's a part of this list of container best practices where they say only put the things you need in your container images. But I always wonder, is there anybody who puts junk in their containers intentionally? I don't think anybody does that. And the
Right.
problem there is that you just don't know what you need. And sometimes you kind of know, but not always, because you need everything. You need to know everything at every layer. And that's a problem. So the theory and reality weren't on the same page. And now we're getting close to the reality. And uh, there are two parts to it. First, you got to be able to build those minimal container images. And now there are different options to do that.
Right.
And that's awesome. And then you also need to be able to use them. So we'll get to that part later on. But creating those minimal container images is tricky. Like I said, you need to know what to put in them. There are always a number of experts who can do it on their own. But it's about the masses adopting the practice. And for the
Right.
masses, you need the easy button. So now we have a few easy buttons, and DockerSlim is one of them, where I figured, I know the container internals, I can do it, but I don't want to do it. I'm too lazy to do it.
Right.
So is there a way to
Right.
automate it? And that's how it was created. I wanted to automate that process, even though I could do it, and it worked. I used it for my services. The very first service I used it with was a Node.js microservice. So there's a number of different runtimes and container types where it works better, and other runtimes and application types where you need to do a little more. And that's because of how it was created. I built it to solve my own problems with my
Right.
own applications,
Yeah.
with my own containers, and then eventually it evolved and all of that. But it's not the only way. Using scratch images is another way to do it, and but the Go, for example, you can do static compilation. But if you need time zone information and the user ID information, et cetera, maybe assets, certificates, now you get into this realm where scratch images isn't sufficient. Now you need to
Right.
add other things, and you need to know about those things. Then you graduate to the distroless images, because they have different tiers of distroless images where they provide that additional information that you can leverage, but the time zone information, the directory layout, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are multiple tiers. And now, obviously, we also have the Wolfie and Chainguard images, which are awesome. And they're doing an awesome community service, especially
Yeah.
now that the images are available in Docker Hub. I think that's going to improve a lot. So
Yeah.
there are, different options, but you can still do it the hard way if you want to control everything about the image.
Yeah, and it used to only be the hard way. Like I can remember, it wasn't that long ago that we had we had people like using brute force methods where you would export the image out and into the file system and then import it back in order to get a single layer and reduce space that way. And then we had sort of all these different ideas around how do we shrink the image. And I think it was like a year and a half ago. I was actually in I think it was Civo Navigate down in Florida, and I gave a talk around just a ton of security tools for basically the whole software lifecycle that are I sort of I think 30 or 40 tools, and I was just throwing everything at the audience and saying like, look at all these things you can do to actually tighten down your supply chain. It's obviously, I mean, images is just one little tiny part of this giant framework of everything in the software lifecycle that needs attention. And when I started talking about container images, because that tends to be our deployment object now, it's our golden disk artifact that everybody is using, and I kind
And
of
you
looked
can
at
use
this.
them with the serverless now, with
Yeah,
Lambdas and Cloud Run and all of that. So
yeah,
it's not just for, traditional container runtimes.
yeah, and that I looked at, like you mentioned a lot there about the different ways, and I looked at this as sort of a spectrum of, on one end you have the what I would call, so maybe the hardcore hackers or the container enthusiasts that would
Mhm.
go and actually change their distro and find the minimal image. Traditionally, we would all just use Alpine for that, which I always like to point out that I'm not always a fan of that, and in fact, that's why I love the
There's
Chainguard
a
now. Is
huge
we,
list of problems there, historical
yeah,
problems and current problems, and some of them they addressed, for example, around DNS supporting TCP, which was crazy that they said, no, we're not going to do TCP for
yeah,
DNS.
yeah. The challenge there was like you maybe spent your whole career focusing on CentOS or Debian or Ubuntu or something like that, and then to switch to Alpine for containers always felt like I felt like we were forcing a distro of something down people's throats as the only way they can run their software safely or securely, and I always felt like that was
Exactly.
aggressive and maybe just not doesn't fit everyone. And I love that fact. We had a show, by the way, if you're all watching and you're wondering about these Chainguard thing we keep mentioning, we had a whole show a month ago. So after this show, come back to this channel and look for the Chainguard image show where we talk a little bit about. It was like right after the announcement of them moving all their images to Docker Hub. Or not moving, but allowing you to pull them from Docker Hub as well as from Chainguard's registry. So that was a great thing that Docker partnered with them on. But I always looked at this as kind of a spectrum of there's those people, and then there's what I saw you doing at Slim AI, which was let's do this after the fact. Let's instead of at the beginning where we're recreating a Docker file, let's build what we think we want, and then after the
Mm.
fact, analyze it and pull things out we don't need, whether it's whether it's automated or maybe it's just something manual. And I thought that both approaches were necessary. Like I didn't feel like there was one that everybody fits, and like it's not a
Sure.
one size fits all scenario. And we do need those teams that aren't container experts. We need those teams to be able to use some tool that will help them understand their image and help them shrink it without forcing a complete distro change on every single project.
Exactly. And that can be a lot of work because
Mhm.
when you're starting a new project, it's easy. When you have an existing project, that's when it gets complicated.
Yeah.
And maybe you can invest into a refactor, but sometimes it's not possible. And sometimes you don't even control the OS that you get. For example, you're buying a piece of third-party software, they give you RPMs.
Right.
Now you have to run CentOS. It wasn't your choice. You didn't
Right.
choose. Your vendor chose for you. So sometimes you don't even control that. And other times you invested so much in the existing setup that it's just too expensive to change. And
Right.
it's great when you can change, but a lot of times you can't. So if you're pragmatic, you got to be honest that the
Yeah.
majority of applications they will not change, even though over time they will start transitioning to something better and all of that. So I like the old Microsoft approach. You meet the developers where they are.
Hmm.
You don't ask people to change. Asking
Right.
developers to change or people in general is hard. It's a hard
Yeah.
sell. It's a lot of friction. So uh, getting the outcomes they want without requiring the change is a great approach to get what you need.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are a lot of use cases where that's better to do. Sure, is it perfect all the time? Not always. Do you need to do a little extra sometimes? Yes, you do. It's not always the Nginx example where you don't need anything else and all
Right.
of that. So, there's always something. It depends, but it's good to have options. And like you said, it's a spectrum, and it depends on your use cases, where you are in terms of your phase of your product and your application and all of that.
Yeah. All right, let's get into DockerSlim, which I want to point out first. Let's talk a little bit about the name change. So last time we were on the show, it was moving from the name DockerSlim to Slim Toolkit.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're working on getting into the CNCF project list, or you have. I'm not sure if that's complete or not,
Oh,
but
it's already there. So here's the journey. It started with DockerSlim because Docker was the only runtime.
right.
Eventually, later on, much later on, it started expanding its container runtime support. So it wasn't just Docker anymore. So, so that was one of the reasons for the name change. But when it was time to join CNCF, during the submission process, we got feedback saying that, well, the name needs to change. So I promised
Right.
to change the name, and they were nice enough not to make it a hard requirement uh, for
Oh, for
the
submit. Yeah, for
admission.
acceptance. Yeah.
But that was a promise that was made, and that's kind of what's happening now. It's transitioning to the new name as promised, and in a way, it's more generic as well because Min stands for minimal container images. And the CLI name Mint is actually pretty nice because you can mint awesome containers with it, and it's a good name. It's a good name. So
Yeah.
that's why.
I like the new name. Yeah, I love the new name. So we're calling it MinToolkit, or Mint for short.
Yep,
And
Mint.
and so for the rest of this show, everybody, when we say Mint, we're talking about DockerSlim. Um,
Exactly.
and I mean, branding is hard, right? What do we say? Like the hardest thing in engineering is picking a name, right? So it's a hard thing to do. But I pulled this up on screen because this was to me like originally how I knew Mint
Yep.
was. It was building my image. Um, it was doing things inside it. It was allowing me to inspect it or maybe understand it a little bit
Hmm.
better. A lot of people are familiar with Dive, and those people that are familiar with Dive, how would you compare like Dive to Mint, like the purposes?
Good question. Uh, DockerSlim Mint started as a way to minify containers, and that was super popular. But it wasn't the only capability. The next capability that I added later on was X-ray. So X-ray, you can think of that as Dive on steroids into what kind of information it gives you.
Hmm.
The only thing that's nicer with Dive is the terminal UI. And terminal UI is something that we experimented with at the last KubeCon EU. There was a session on terminal UI for the project where we try to learn bubble tea. And bubble tea, if you're using Go, bubble tea is probably the most popular terminal UI library
Hmm.
um, to use. So pretty soon, X-ray will be as good as Dive in terms of the user interface. But in
Mm.
terms of the data it gives you, it's, I don't know, I wouldn't say 10 times better, but you get a lot more out of it. Additional insights about the certificates, about security data in the container image. You can even search for stuff in container images. You can use the X-ray command as a grep for containers. You can say, Mint is actually a grep for containers, and you can look for strings, etc.
Hmm.
from command line, which not a lot of people know, but you can do that. And
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
yeah,
Keep going.
no, go ahead. So there's a lot more that you can do, but it's missing the terminal UI to make it
Yeah.
easier to navigate what's in the container images.
Well, and certainly if you're just looking to walk around. By the way, thank you, Marcus, so much for the money. I appreciate you, Marcus. Thanks for the super chat. By the way, I want to mention that you are all over YouTube. So for those that are interested in a lot of this stuff, Kyle's got his hands in a lot of things. If you just even go onto YouTube and just search, like I did earlier before the show, Kyle Quest KubeCon, just this year alone, just in the last 2 months, there's 3 different videos on the CNCF channel with your evidently related to you. I mean, your name is in the title of all of them. So you had a lightning talk on there. You're talking about building the tool and adding the new features we're going to get into, the debug features. You've got a sort of a talk around the journey of Slim, the company, and how like the whole world of open source and startups and stuff like that, which is obviously a tale for those that are interested in creating their own open source and maybe someday making money on it. I'm sure that's a very interesting one. But if you scroll back, I mean, there's a lot. You've got a lot of videos. And it all seems to be focused around helping people with containers. Like you are the DockerSlim guy. You're going to have to change all that to the Mint guy.
No, the name is still, it's still good.
Yeah, it's still a good name.
But there are other things that DockerSlim can do. And we can actually ask the AI assistant what DockerSlim can do. So later on we can do that, and then we'll ask more things because
let's get into it because I know that. Sorry, I was going to say that you and I at KubeCon, like we started talking about debug, and that was actually I think maybe that might have been the idea for the origin of this show like 2 months ago, which seems forever ago. And of course, you've added other things. You've even started a new company since then that I didn't even know about. So let's talk about debug for a little bit. So this is like a relatively new thing in Mint?
It is relatively new. The very first time, and there's a talk about the debug command in the project at KubeCon EU. It talks about the history and how it started. It actually started as a hackathon project at KubeCon EU Valencia. And one of the community members decided to do that, and he actually won that mini hackathon. If you scroll to the next slide, a couple of slides after that.
Oh yeah, how it started. There. So in Europe, 2022, yeah.
And Dan was awesome, and he was the first person to add this capability for the Docker runtime, and that's how it started. And then it got extended with support for Kubernetes, and then later on for Containerd and Podman, covering pretty much all major runtimes.
Nice.
And this is important because we talked about creating minimal container images, but yeah, that's a good quote. People will not use them if they can't debug them.
Yeah.
I heard it all the time. It's like, okay, you create this minimal container image. It doesn't even have a shell. What am I supposed to do with it if it crashes, if I need to debug it? So that was the pushback. And for a number of different reasons, the ability to debug wasn't quite there. For example, with Kubernetes, it didn't have that capability a while back. Now you have ephemeral containers and the ephemeral container-based debugging capabilities, which makes it possible for minimal containers to get the adoption it deserves. So we're getting to the point where the tech is where it needs to be in terms of creating minimal container images and using minimal container images.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the KubeCon ephemeral. That to me, it's like, not the KubeCon, sorry, the Kube Control ephemeral. That functionality, and our friend Victor Farsake actually has a pretty good video on YouTube about it. It's sort of not showing off its functionality, but also kind of picking on it because just like everything else in Kube Control, it's raw, it's a little complicated. You have to know a bunch of options to get it to work every time, and it doesn't do everything and has some side effects. And that, so thanks, Victor. I learned a lot from you actually on that without having to actually go test all the scenarios myself. Um, and so we've also seen other companies get into this game, right? Like Docker now has a new debug command
Yep.
for paid plans. That's an important distinction that I think you and I want to point out is they announced at DockerCon last year, like basically adding some Nix functionality into this idea of like, if you have a minimal image, one, like you mentioned, that you can't even get into it when it's running as a container because it has no shell.
Exactly.
And then even if you could get a shell in there somehow by you copy one in, or you could sort of hack your way through something. What else are you going to do on there? Like you probably don't have curl, you probably don't have any tools
Mm-hmm.
or to do anything in there. So what do you do then? Like, do you have to, I mean, I was always a fan of NetShoot and other sort of massive container images, but then how do you have to sort of become an expert suddenly on how you get that adjacent, how do you share namespaces and PID namespace, all these different concepts that someone didn't actually they never had to know all of that before containers. It's almost like we saddled them with a new problem of, well, containers are supposed to be
Exactly.
great, but now you got to know all this stuff just to be able to do the same debugging you did yesterday. And I've always kind of felt bad about that because when you get someone, back in the day when we were all like telling our friends, hey, you got to try out this Docker thing. It always felt like, well, now that you got it running, and they were always like, well, now what do I do? Because everyone, I mean, like me, I did the same mistake early on where I thought it needed to be a full Ubuntu server inside my image, right? I needed all the
Mm-hmm.
tools. I needed SSH daemon running. I needed all these things. And we sort of learned all that at the beginning, but I think a lot of us stopped when the complexity went through the roof for how do I debug this when it's minimal, and that's a great, like you're saying, this is a great quote. I just left it on the screen because I thought this was such a great defining the real problem we're talking about with debugging. Because sure, if you're a Linux guru, NSEnter, all these tools you can use, but a lot of us aren't that. In fact, most of the
Yeah,
teams I work with are not that.
exactly. The masses are not container experts, and they should need to be.
Right.
If the whole point behind Docker is that it simplified your user experience, your developer experience with the low-level Linux kernel constructs, made it approachable and made it available to the masses. And that's kind of the whole point. And now we have these certain gaps where we kind of fold back to this hole where now you need to be an expert on the internals. So
Right.
that was the whole point behind DockerSlim, creating minimal container images. You shouldn't have to be a container expert. You mentioned squashing layers and all of that. That's too low level. A regular developer shouldn't need to know about that. Same with debugging container images. You use kube-control debug, or you try to do it natively with the Docker runtime where you're attaching to the namespaces. Again, you're kind of going lower level. And again, you need to know a lot more about containers than you should. And that
Yeah.
was, again, the idea behind the debug command where we wanted to get close to the developer experience you have normally uh, using minimal container images. So you have a sidecar that attaches to your target container, but when you are in the container, you want to see the file system of the target. You want to interact with the applications and binaries that you have in your target container and in your debug container, as if it's one big fat container
Right.
that you're used to.
Right.
And that was the
Right.
intent. That was kind of the design, the high level design. And it's a little different from the Docker debugging capability design. They have a nice Nix angle there. And I think the more tool we have in that space, the better it is, because it's about gaining the adoption and momentum there.
Mhm.
And I think everybody wins there. So like you mentioned, it is a paid feature. So one of the benefits you get with DockerSlim is that you don't need to pay for it, and you get more runtimes. It's possible that Docker will add support for other runtimes as well, but who knows? It's a free open source alternative, and it's always good
Right.
to have those options. And obviously you can do a lot more but the tool. But that's one of the fundamental capabilities, complementary to the initial minification capability, because you need to have a sane way to debug your images, and
Right.
this is what it's about. But there are other commands that are available, and like I said, we'll ask AI what that is.
All right. Well, I think we've been talking about this a lot, and I actually spent only a few minutes playing with the debug command before this show, so I am selfishly here to learn, see some demos, and learn some things and how I can use Mint, which I did download to my computer. While we're getting the demo ready, I want to throw out a couple of things if others are listening, because this is also going to end up in a podcast form. If people are listening, there's a great, basically Kyle has partnered with a couple of other also great people at the last KubeCon. So I will, in the show notes, there will be a link to basically the talk from KubeCon called "Building a Tool to Debug Minimal Container Images." And on Kubernetes, Docker, and Containerd. So it's sort of becoming this idea around a universal debugging tool. This is a single binary you can download on your machine, right? Like this, or maybe there's two binaries. I think
There are two binaries.
Yeah.
There's an archive with two binaries: the main app and the sensor. You don't need the sensor if you're just debugging. You need the sensor when you need to minify. So you can use only the main app, and that's pretty much it. And that's Mint. There are a couple of symlinks for the old names, DockerSlim and Slim, but you don't need them either.
Yeah, and I want to point out some things. This will probably, a lot of this, I'm guessing, will change over time. But if you're looking into all this stuff now, the DockerSlim website and the Slim Toolkit GitHub repo still exist, right? So there's,
Yep.
It seems like you're kind of dancing between two different repos that have the same Slim/Mint functionality.
Yeah, it's just a matter of time and cycles. There's more stuff to take care of, to consolidate and resolve a whole bunch of questions. And if you look at the Mint repo, some of the images aren't there. Some of the images still have the old names. So it takes time. But
yeah, sure. I mean, there's certainly a lot of logistics. Not only are you rebranding all the marketing and all the screenshots, all the videos, but you've also got to rebuild things, change the names of binaries and build tools. And I noticed, like, because I had actually, I think it was Slim Toolkit or DockerSlim, one of the two installed through Homebrew on my Mac, and I wanted to basically move to Mint. So I don't know if I did the right thing, but I removed it. I removed the Homebrew app from my computer, and then I just downloaded the two binaries from here and followed your instructions, basically untarred them and moved them over to my user local bin directory. So I'm sure that in the future there will be all the things will be migrated and everything will be transparent and everyone will be on the new stuff. But we're in the middle of this, so I want to just let people know that they might end up in the wrong place, and so to check out, look for the github.com/mint or MinToolkit. I have to say it right. GitHub.com/MinToolkit. You can just go there. It's an organization you set up. And that's going to be in the CNCF project that you're now working on. That's going to be what everybody's calling it is MinToolkit. So look for that.
Will be.
All right, let's do some demos.
Okay, so let's ask. So here's one of my screens. There's an assistant app right now for MinToolkit that helps you. It's not public yet, so this is an exclusive demo. But the intent is to make it available, and I'm still trying to figure out if it should be a web interface there just for the assistant part, because then there's also a command part and etc. But we'll see a few things here. So I'll ask the assistant to list all available commands. It's a little slow. It's not doing streaming intentionally to save, not on cost, but to save on the requests, because I ended up hitting rate limits with OpenAI. So I wanted to avoid that. That's one of the reasons. Okay, we got a response. So let's see. We have a whole bunch of different commands. Debug is one of them. X-ray. There's also lint. This is kind of like a traditional lint. And The intent there is to make it work with container images as well. So you lint container images, not just Docker files, because that's what you usually normally get, linting Docker files.
Yeah,
Obviously,
true.
the build command or also slim command, there's a number of registry commands. People probably don't know. You can pull, push, create indexes. There's a profile command to get runtime information. You can even run container images. You can merge images as well if you want to. It works nicely with the build command or slim command when you minify your image with different profiles and you want to put them together. That's a way to do it. There's kind of just basic image information commands and also basic vulnerability related information. Right now it's for looking up EPSS scores for vulnerabilities, but there'll be more. And then a few other things, including this bomb command that gives you the bill of material for the executable that you have. And I think every application should have that. It should be able to produce its bill of material. So hopefully we're starting a trend there. So
Yeah.
we know about the commands. So we can ask.
By the way, I should tell people in case if they're watching the demo, you're using the like this is like an alpha feature. This is like pre-alpha AI feature that you're interacting with. So you can type these commands normally, but we're sort of just playing around with the AI part.
Yeah.
By the way, oh, sorry. I was going to say real quick, are these commands, do all these commands work across because this isn't actually running containers on itself, right? It has to have a container runtime and connect to that. So it originally would require Docker, but do all these commands actually work against like a Kubernetes pod, or what is that like? What are my requirements here for running this?
That's a good question. Depending on the command, the support for the container runtimes is different. For the build command or the slim command, the Docker and Kubernetes runtimes are supported. The containerd and Podman runtimes are not supported yet, and Podman has been the most requested feature
really?
from that perspective. Yeah, because a lot of people use the Red Hat tools, and especially in the government, or those who need to deal with FedRAMP. One of the people who asked about the Podman and Builder support was from the Air Force. So there is an audience there, and it's pretty popular. And when it comes to the debug command, that's when you have all four runtimes: Docker, Kubernetes, Podman, and Containerd. So that's a good question to ask.
All right, enough questions for me. Sorry.
What container
Back to the demo.
runtimes are supported by the debug command? That's the question I ask the assistant. It's going to be a couple of seconds to look it up, and it will give us the response. So let's see. So it's looking up answer, and like I said, it's not okay. So you gotta love live demos. I'll ask
we didn't
it
pay
again.
homage to the demo gods before we started this stream.
And it's open AI. You never know, because I could be hitting the rate limit.
Or they could have just released a new thing, and then everyone wants to go try it, and it's all down, and we didn't know.
Okay, so it answered the question. Okay. So there, it gives you the information about supported runtimes. So there's a so you can ask it.
So it's kind of like I can avoid reading the manual. Like I can avoid reading through the docs. I can just ask.
For example, how to use MinToolkit to debug Podman containers. And it's going to give me an overview. And it's pretty decent, actually, because with Podman, you need to make sure that Podman is running. Mint doesn't automatically start Podman for you. And there is a set of instructions for it. in the README, but it's nice to ask specific questions and then get answers there, and then just follow that, and it's pretty decent. For example, the next question I'll ask is about one of the flags that are relevant. So once it comes back, oh, actually it did come back. So right there, it gives you a set of instructions. It says first start the Podman service, and it gives you the snapshot if you're on Linux. And on Macs, for example, if you use Podman desktop, you don't need to do that. On Linux, you would run this command, and then it gives you a sample how to connect to that runtime. There's a flag to connect to the endpoint, Podman endpoint. And then one more question I'll ask. I'll ask it to explain the run as target shell flag. And run as target shell flag is one of those UX enhancements you get with Mint debugging. When you connect to the target and it feels like you are in that target container image, as opposed to the debug image, because that's what you usually get when you use kube control debug. You end up in your debug image environment as opposed to the target image environment. And it gives
right. So target in the context there, that was, I actually wasn't sure about that. The word target implies the target container that I'm trying to troubleshoot. Yeah.
Exactly. So this is an example of this AI assistant that they'll be able to answer questions and later on run commands for you. But that was built based on the feedback I got, because people struggle to find information sometimes, and it's nice to be able to ask that information. And what it is, it's a pretty basic RAG using the assistant API in OpenAI. They have V2 that's been enhanced, and it's vector store. It has a built-in vector store, and it does a better job now. Still doesn't support a lot of file types, but you can always default to the text files. For example, it supports C files, it supports JavaScript files, C# files, but not Go files, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a basic RAG using OpenAI Assistant, but custom data from Discord, from issues, from the source code, and all of that. So it's able to answer the questions that you ask there.
Nice.
So let's see. Let's start with the most low-level runtime, and that's the containerd runtime. I have a VM, a Vagrant VM running with containerd and nerd control. And if you're using containerd directly, you probably know what nerd control is. It's kind of like a low-level equivalent of the Docker CLI. And you get mostly the same behavior. There are a few minor differences. But here I'm going to run a minified container images that I built.
Yeah, so you're starting in the example target container, right? And it's got Nginx and nothing else in it, I assume, because it's called Nginx Slim. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. So the container is running, and it's a containerd image. And now the VM is not perfectly set up, so I need to use sudo. And I'm going to use the interactive prompt mode. And that's been a very nice enhancement, and I didn't think it was that great and that useful, but then I got feedback from users saying that it was a game changer, but the interactive CLI prompt made it easier to configure different parameters, because you also have autocompletes for some of them, especially container names, etc. And that's pretty convenient. And so let's pick the debug command, and then we'll use the containerd runtime and run. So run as target shell is one of the parameters, but it's on by default. So I'm not going to set it anyways. I'll need to configure the target, and right there I have autocomplete. It's so much nicer to have that as opposed to looking for the name or the
Right.
image ID.
Tabbing a bunch
Uh,
of times, or trying to configure ZSH auto completion, which I get questions a lot. You would be surprised how many students are always wanting they see autocomplete for Docker and kubectl in my demos, and then they're like, I gotta have all of that, and they don't realize the difference between ZSH and Bash, and like just all the little subtle nuances that nobody should have to care about in shells. So that I'm actually warming up to it too, because I traditionally didn't use it either with DockerSlim back in the day. But now seeing it in Mint, it makes me kind of wish I had that with a lot of my tools like Docker and kubectl.
exactly. So right there, if I look for Nginx, it'll find Nginx. I can Nginx conf. I can access Nginx directly, but that's not what you get by default.
Right.
And we'll do a default kind of example, but that's not why you're getting it. And if you look at the PS output, there's this funny looking shell command that's doing something. So if we look under the hood and we list the content of the file system, there's a number of hidden directories. So if we look at them, you'll see that they are symlinks. They're symlinks to the binary directories from my debug image. So it says /proc, /31, /root, etc., etc. So normally you access the file system from different environment for the target image through the proc file system going to proc1. And here it kind of it's the opposite, where it's accessing the files from the debug image using the proc file system, and as opposed to having to do it explicitly and manually, it sets up a symlink for different bin directories, and it makes them accessible, and then it does a change route, so your file system looks like you're connected to the target image. And there are a few gotchas in terms of when you can change route, and we'll talk about that, especially with the Chainguard images, but that's kind of the general idea. So for me as a developer, it looks very similar to having a fat container with the tools and the shell and all of that. I can do things directly. My UX is the same. And that's kind of the high level design goal for the debug command there.
Yeah, so let me recap real quick. So that what we're talking about is you ran a simple debug command. It was, less than 100 characters, and you were able to get into a running container on one of multiple choices of runtimes, and in this case you use containerd, and you had your own debug, or I guess it defaulted to a certain debug image. I guess we'll talk about that in a minute. And gave you a shell inside a shellless container with the tools that came with your debug image. Because that's kind of for people that don't know about NetShoot and some of the other traditional, what we would call debug images, that's kind of the concept you've taken to the next level, I feel like, with this tool, which is you have now multiple choices, and you don't have to. You can, but you don't. I think you can, but you don't have to bring your own, which was always a challenge with my students, because they would ask about debugging, and then we'd have to explain all the stuff we just did, and then I would have to say, well, now you got to go find an image to use, because you're going to need some things. You're probably going to want some tools. And where do you find those tools? Well, you might just be your own Linux expert and you build your own. And that's when the students go off on a complete tangent. And I feel like it's one of these scenarios where like all they wanted to do was be able to cat a file in a directory or look at the process list or something like that. But now they're down this rabbit hole of like, what is NetShoot? Who's Nikolai? Like, what am I looking at this thing for? Yeah. So it's cool that you kind of build this stuff in, so you don't have to know all of that starting out.
So that's a good point, and there's a built-in list of different debug images. Netshoot is one of them, by the way. And there's more that can be done there, especially with the AI assistant, because you can say, hey, I need to be able to do that kind of debugging. So it would pick the right debug
Mm,
image ultimately. It's not doing this right now, but that would be a great use case where, again, you wouldn't even need to know the name of the debug image to pick. You just share your intent, and
right.
it'll be selected automatically, or it would be built on the fly. There are interesting ways to build debug container images on the fly using Nixery.dev, where you can
Mm,
say, hey, I want an image, and with those packages in them. And so there's an opportunity to do that dynamically. So that would be uber cool. Uh,
yeah. Yeah. I didn't actually know about Nixery because I have yet to really fully dive into the Nix community, even though everyone's like, do Nix videos, add Nix to your courses, have Nix on the show. Like everybody wants to know all the stuff, but Nixery,
yeah. So this
ad
is a
hoc container
subset.
images.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's not, you don't have to get into Nix completely. It's just a way to dynamically create images with the stuff that you need. And it's a
Hmm.
perfect match for the debug container image use cases, because the tools you might need might be different based on the kind of debugging scenario that you need to deal with. So
Nice.
let's try debugging a Podman image. So I'm going to run a minimal Nginx image there as well. It's running, and then I'll do the same thing here. I'll pick debug, a runtime, Podman, and then let's see debug images. So this is an example there, and actually there's well, it's close enough.
Yeah.
So there's a list of different images, and there's a couple of Chainguard images. There's a base Wolfie image that you can use, and then there's also a dedicated MinToolkit debug image that they were nice enough to create. So Dan was really nice and responsive. I asked them, "Is it possible?" And he said, "Yeah, sure." And the guys came up with that image in no time. So Chainguard is awesome.
Yeah.
And then there are more traditional images like BusyBox and then Netshoot and a number of CoolKit images, though some of them are slightly out of date. That's why there's the MinToolkit version of the Golang CoolKit container image. So it has the newest Delve debugger in it. So it's also a matter of maintaining those tools, and that'll be one of the things that will happen with the debug command as well. So the main idea there is that you have a list of these different debug images that you don't need to look around. You can just pick one of them, and that's it. So if you look at the BusyBox image, and maybe we'll do a demo for that as well. It's pinned to a specific digest, and it's interesting because the latest version of BusyBox is different from what it used to be. It used to be all static. So this is one of the other finer points of debug images, where ideally, you need statically compiled binaries, because you're moving those binaries, exposing those binaries to a different context, to a different environment. And doing those symlinks works for the binary itself, but if it loads shared libraries dynamically, then you might have problems depending on the runtime you have in the target container image. If the target container image runtime, meaning the CLib versions, etc., are close enough to the runtime versions of your debug image, then you won't have a problem. But it's not always the case, especially if you're using, I don't know, an Alpine image, a classic Alpine with muzzle in it, and your debug image is a traditional glib based image. Some of those libraries might not be there. So when you have binaries that load shared libraries dynamically, you can have problems. And that's what it looks like that's the case with BusyBox now. Now it's not fully static. Now it loads CLib dynamically. And you can solve this, and Nix has a solution. I don't know if you explored it, but Nix is at a high level. If you use a couple of construct there, it's a bunch of directories and symlinks. So at runtime, it symlinks to the right directory for you. That includes the right version of the binary and the library. And then it configures the path directory, path environmental variable, so the right thing gets picked up. And then something similar for shared libraries. Unfortunately, with shared libraries, it's a little more complicated. So there's an environmental variable there that you need to configure dynamically for each executable. And Nix does all that behind the scene because, again, it deals with those dynamically loaded shared libraries. So that's, for those kind of debug images, that's exactly what will need to happen. And there's an experimental version of it in Mint, but it's not fully baked yet. So it was a unexpected surprise for me when I was trying to use the latest version of BusyBox, and it failed. I was like, what happened? Why is it telling me that it can't find glib? Because it's supposed to be static, and it turned out that it's no longer static. That's why this BusyBox image is pinned to a specific digest that's still static to simplify things. So I can pick any images, but by default, it picks the BusyBox. So target, Nginx. Well, how about debug image? And I don't need to use any of those images. I can just say BusyBox latest.
Oh yeah, you can. So you can use a standard nomenclature for finding an image somewhere on the internet. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And then later on, there will be a way to autocomplete based on the public registries as well. It's a nice enhancement. If anybody wants to contribute, that'll be a nice contribution. That's the awesome part about open source. You can contribute. So, okay, we have the debug image, target, and we'll pick the Nginx image there. Right there, if I do PS, I get this. And that's exactly what I was talking about. And if I exit, I do debug, runtime, Podman, target, same target, and I'm going to use the pinned BusyBox.
Oh, okay.
Oops. Not a problem anymore.
Yeah, so this is one of those things where, like, for a lot of people, especially if they're junior people learning containers and for the first time, and they're maybe not super fluent on Linux and how libraries are called, that this could be like a blocker, right? Like, this is back when you go back to Google and you're searching, like, what does this even mean? And traditionally, like, this was rarely ever seen unless you had a screwed up system, because we were all so used to fat servers, and we were all so used to everything's on this server. All the libraries I need are already here. The distribution, Ubuntu, CentOS, whatever, managed most of that for me, and I just use their package manager to install stuff. And it's one of those things where we have this history, and I've had rants on this show where a soapbox moment that I won't get into today, but the summary of all that is, like, a lot of system design changes that are seemingly difficult to deal with in containers were all things we made decisions 20, 30, 40, sometimes even 50 years ago, and we had different problems then. And I get to this whole rant around new languages versus old languages and why I poo-poo a bunch of old languages, just because they were solving problems in the 90s that we no longer really have. We have new and different problems now, and their architecture and opinions all affect that. So this is actually a really good demo, even for those that didn't get to see this because they're maybe listening to the podcast, where we're showing how if you have the concept of not a statically compiled binary, you might have library problems, and you might have, if things were compiled differently, you might have problems in your container where you're trying to do something with a glib binary in a container that's running MuSil or vice versa or something like that. These are things that I pretend to understand. So I talk about them a lot in my courses even, but I'm not really studying like how these libraries are calling each other. So even I learned from you, I think it was in your talk, like the LD and some of the environment variables and things like that are managed in your shell by applications. And I learned a lot. So I mean, I'm going to recommend again to everyone, if they're really into this stuff and they want to understand more of the debug, just look up, basically just watch all the videos that say Kyle Quest KubeCon on YouTube, and you'll be there for hours, but you'll learn a lot of stuff because this stuff can go pretty deep pretty quick. But I like how you're making it, especially you're really showing off the UI here of being in the interactive shell, how it solves a lot of these problems for you on not knowing. If you don't know a debug image you need to use, just try one. If that didn't work, try the other one, and it's going to pop up a list for you. Yeah, so it's pretty neat. I like the flow.
Exactly, and that's the whole point, and that's the intent behind the next generation of the interface, the AI-based interface, where
Mm-hmm.
It's even more user-friendly, and you can interact with it in a more sophisticated way, as in not restricted to a specific flow. So
Right.
let's take a look at one of the Kubernetes examples, and I have several flavors there, and this one is interesting. I have a manifest with the Chainguard Nginx image. It's a minimal container image. It doesn't have a shell, and one of the things that we have here is the security spec. So if you have this security spec that says run as non-root, you'll have to deal with extra gotchas, and it's yet another example of having to know low-level details, especially when it comes to debugging. Because now, if you're using that netshoot container image or some other container image that happens to run as root by default, if you use kubectl debug, you'll get a cryptic error and you won't know what's going on. So,
Right.
unlike that flow, let's see. Well, kubectl apply f. Okay, kubectl get pods. Okay, it's starting up. Okay, it's up, and we can curl. Well, we can get in. I'm pretty sure we can get in. And let's do the same thing. We'll debug. We'll pick the runtime, Kubernetes, and with the Kubernetes runtime, there are you get auto completion for the namespace. I can pick default and all, but I don't even need to pick the default if that's where I'm running. So it'll pick the default namespace by default. Then you can pick the pod that you want to work with. And again, I don't have to pick it if I only have one pod. So I'm not even going to do it. And then I'm going to pick the target, and right there. And technically, well, maybe I don't even need to pick the target there. I think there's a nice default there as well, but I'll pick it anyways. So right there, that's all I selected. And I have this special Kubernetes manifest with run as non-root in it, and I'm not doing anything extra. So hopefully it works. The last time it did. So now it's starting an ephemeral container. That's what we're waiting for.
So you're taking advantage of that. Well, maybe maybe not a brand new feature, but a relatively new feature of ephemeral containers.
Okay. So yes. So right there, PS, and note the shell prompt. It's not not the usual root prompt. It's a regular user prompt. Who am I? I'm actually user 65532, and cat etc. Pas WD. I think that's where it is. Yep, that's where it is. Uh, oh, yeah, because it's not. So what happened? What are we looking at? We're actually looking at the password file for the debug image. How come we're not looking at the target environment? So here's what happened. The pod manifest has the run as non-root flag set. And because of that, you can't change root in the target environment file system. And the debug command detects that dynamically, that it can't change root. So it's not doing that. And because of that, it's not, so you're not looking at the target file system, but you can still get to it the old fashioned way, which is proc1 root. And
like
that's actually
earlier,
cat proc1 root etc pass wd, and that's where we're going to get the nginx user, and that's 65532, the user I'm running as. So transparently, you can set the user ID and the group ID explicitly with command line parameters, and you can pick them dynamically in the interactive prompt mode as well. Not the values, but the flags themselves. But there's a nice flow there where it tries to figure out the user ID it should use if it's configured to run as non-root, and if the image doesn't use root as the user. So that's what happened internally. So you have access. You don't have as many nice things, but at least you are able to access the target environment.
Yeah, and that's actually a really great demo, because this is another stumbling block that you're pointing out, where everything might work locally on Docker, but then they use a pod spec that essentially is going to further limit what they're doing, what it's running and doing in Kubernetes. And now suddenly they have this whole new set of problems that they don't have locally, and they maybe don't have the tools or depth of knowledge to figure this all out. I mean, I probably would spend hours trying to figure out my first couple of times, like how do I get into this thing, and how do I see the file system, and where do I find my process list, and that kind of thing. I just want to mention for people, if they're still watching, before we get back to the demo, if you're curious about that pod spec stuff, specifically like the things where you run not as root and you want to tighten up your own Kubernetes, which I highly recommend. Like, you probably should be doing all this stuff, but again, like Kyle's pointing out, a lot of times it's a barrier, and so we're going to get more into that in a minute. But I have a pod spec demo. I mention it very often on the show. This is basically my recommended pod spec, and it lights up all those security features. So it's turning on seccomp. It's forcing the user in group. It's setting the running as non-root. It's preventing privilege escalation. And these are all things that just I look at this as like it's a pendulum of security and convenience. We're always managing that security and convenience pendulum. And this is taking it hard to the security side, which will then make everything harder to troubleshoot unless you're using Kyle's tools. But this is one of those things where I would try to implement this with teams as the DevOps guy, and we would have challenges with the developers just because they always assume they had root, or because it's maybe an old app that they always had root on servers when they built them, because maybe they needed to run on port 80, so they just assumed they had root, right? And so it becomes this whole project just to enable like one security feature in a Kubernetes pod spec, because you need to educate all the developers, you need to help them with the testing tools, debug tools. So I'm a fan of the fact that you're solving yet another challenging problem. You talk about this again back on the YouTube video. You talk about that in the slides. I actually think I had the slide pulled up here on this of like the gotchas around changing the root file path, having being the same user and group ID as the user in the pod, or in that container on the pod. And these are all things that I feel like are definitely way more than day one Kubernetes learning. So those of you, if you're watching and you're going through my courses, which we get a lot of people watching from those, don't feel like this is all something you need to know. I didn't know this for the year one. Like I know this stuff I've struggled with for many years before. I think feeling comfortable with it, and
it has many layers. Really yeah, and it's okay not to get to everything right away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And
All right, back to the
and
demo.
yeah, and then we have additional helper flags. For example, there's this mount target volumes flag or load target and vars flag. And what does it mean? So those are nice kind of UX enhancements where you can reload the environmental variables from the target container into the debug container when you're running, because
Nice.
normally they're not available. You
Yeah.
can mount the volumes, target environment volumes, and that's more relevant when you're not running as root, uh, because otherwise, yeah, you won't have access to them.
Yeah.
And at least historically, kube control debug wouldn't allow you to do that. So you wouldn't be able to mount volumes. It wasn't a part of the features
Yeah,
that
that's
they
right. The feature
supported,
set.
and
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the general idea there to simplify the user experience. There's a flag to use the whole security context from the target, and the behavior that I described. This is controlled. Figuring out the user ID is controlled by this flag fallback to target user flag. It's on by default, but you can disable it. And this is one of the things I can potentially ask the AI to describe. So again, it's nice
Yeah.
to have an assistant to help you uh, with um,
Yeah. This is
with the
actually a
user
really good
experience.
point. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
really saying that you're really driving this AI thing home, and I'm kind of getting it now because a lot of these flags hide the complexity. It's kind of like when you first learn Docker, and I think I counted last time, there's like 80 flags for Docker run, option flags. And so, like, you don't know those all 80 in day one, week one, month one, probably not even year one. And there's not like one, you can't always describe why this has to exist and when you should use it in one line in the dash dash help output, right? So then you're forced to go find docs, and then the docs may only show you the help output. So it can always be, I
Yes,
think,
exactly.
struggling when you're, especially when you're talking about this complex Linux. Uh, Really, we're just talking about Linux shell and Linux kernel functionality that so many people in developer land, ops land, especially, but in developer land, they just don't have to know until now. Like they just could have avoided all that. And you're right in choosing these by default, because most people that are going to try to use a minimal image, I'm assuming that team is also going to be doing things like not running as root and turning on all these or limiting all these privileges in Kubernetes. If not mandated by their security team, they're probably already going to be doing all that stuff. So it's cool that you're solving some of these problems one by one and having the defaults here. So keep going.
And one of
I'll
the
shut up.
one of the gotchas with the flag auto completion is that you still need to know the flag prefix in order to get more information about the flag. And
Yeah.
with the AI interface, you can ask something a little more fuzzy. You don't need to enter the flag name, and you'll get the information you need. And
Like, how do
that's
I get
again,
environment variables into my
yeah.
shell in
So I
Kubernetes or
need
something? Yeah.
this and this and that, and it'll tell you what parameters to use and all. So that's kind of the next level of user experience there, because there's it's an improvement, and the terminal UI interface will be improvement as well. But still, you don't always know where to look. You don't always know the name of it. Or the prefix and all, and it's great to have a more open-ended way to get what you need. So,
Hmm.
and that's the intent. And like I said, this functionality will be built in, and um, there's a number of Kubernetes tools that try to be that assistant slash debugger slash explainer kind of thing. And those tools are built, a lot of them are actually built with Go. For example, Kate's GPT, that's built with Go. So overall, it looks doable. Have a POC there as well. And the model that they use to hook up the API key makes sense as well, because if it's in the CLI, I won't be paying for it. That's going to be super expensive to pay for
Sure.
everybody to
Yeah.
use.
Not
But
everybody
that's
can
the
provide
intent.
unlimited AI access for CLI tools. Hey, real quick before we go further, you mentioned earlier cool kits. I had not heard of cool kits. I had to go look it up. Um, let me pull it up real quick.
Yep.
So if those are others that are learning about this for the first time for me, what's the elevator pitch on this? This is actually sounds like a pretty cool project.
Yeah, so it's a side project from this startup that they created to debug different application runtimes, and they have dedicated images for different types of runtimes. For Node.js, for Go, for Java, for Python, and they and they're designed with a specific set of tools that match that runtime. For example, for the Go debug image, they have the delve debugger in it. And obviously for the JVM image, they have the appropriate Java debugging tools and all of that, obviously the GRE, et cetera, et cetera. So the only gotcha there is that they're slightly out of date. That's what I discovered with, actually, it wasn't me, it was a user who discovered that the delve debugger in the Go image was older and it had bugs. So that's why I ended up creating a new one. But the intent is great. You have dedicated debug toolkits for different runtimes with the right tools for that specific runtime. Because otherwise, you need to have everything, and you don't always have everything, because usually with microservices you have a Java microservice,
Right.
or you have a Node microservice or a Python microservice or whatever AI app you have. So it makes sense to have these stack specific debug images, and that's what they do. And there's NetShoot that's network centric, not specific for a particular application stack, but it is for network troubleshooting.
Yeah.
And so different goals for different image. Slightly out of date. The product was also pretty interesting, because they have a kind of a more advanced platform to interact with your applications in the production environment.
Oh,
So this is
Lightrun.
kind of
Okay.
their open source Lightrun. That's their commercial product.
And for those listening, Cool Kits is with K's, as all Kubernetes
With
tools would
Ks.
require.
Exactly.
So KOOLKITS. So you can check those out. NetShoot, if you just look up, I actually have my own variant of that image because I use it in the courses and in my demos a lot. NetShoot, if you just look up NetShoot one word on GitHub, you'll find Nikolai's option there. Which that's been around, forever. That was probably like pre-Kubernetes, I think. That image has been around since he was working at Docker.
That's
all those
probably
years ago.
the most known debug image that's out there, and the first one that I knew about.
Yeah. And nobody wants a 10 gig image to download on their servers to debug. So it's appropriate that we end up with all these options that you're showing, because those, if you start adding everything, you end up with 10, easily 10 gig, especially if you're talking about multiple language and framework debuggers like that. Those tend to be not small. So
exactly. When you have minimal container images, you can bring in the stuff that you need on demand. That's the nice thing about it.
Yeah, Eric's plus oneing Nico. So he said he was his boss at Docker. Yeah, I haven't seen him in a long time.
Here's another example of using the AI assistant, where I asked about that run as target shell flag, and kind of it gives me an overview about what it is and why, without needing to navigate through the proc file system, etc. So that's the goal, kind of the next frontier in terms of the user interface for
nice.
For Mint.
Well, this seems to be very useful. Obviously, it's not like when we talk a lot about these debug utilities, especially in open source, like it's not debugging for you. That's maybe something we should have talked about at the beginning. But for those that are new, like this is not something that's going to automatically tell you what's wrong with your app or why your container is misbehaving. That's probably a commercial product that is much more advanced.
Exactly. There are a number of companies designed specifically for that. and there'll be a lot more because of LLMs and all.
Right. Yeah. So, but we all kind of need to start somewhere, I feel like, and not everyone can justify or afford big tools like that. Just like we can't all always afford profilers and or not profilers, but um, the observability tool that you plug in APMs. Stuff like that that maybe bigger companies and enterprises can use. But I have a lot of what I call the solo DevOps crew in my community, where it's one person that's kind of saddled with all of this work of just managing CI, managing infrastructure, managing servers and Kubernetes, and just it goes on and on and on. And so I'm always considering like how hard is this for a new person to pick up, and what actual skills do they need to know before they learn this? Because
Yeah,
like obviously you need to be at some level of developer, depending I guess when you're troubleshooting in your container. Maybe you're just troubleshooting, does it even have network connectivity? I don't know. So maybe you don't need to be a full-on developer to do that, which we also have a lot of that come to this channel is people that are not full-time developers. They're just operations people, sysadmins that maybe don't program for a living. So they're looking for tools that aren't so programmer specific. And so that's like the NetShoot utility from the container image for NetShoot. That's got a ton of just standard Linux utilities in cat, stuff like that you can use in an image or use in a
yeah,
container
exactly.
rather. So
And just to
um,
reiterate, the intent behind the debug command and the user experience there is to get you to the same user experience you have with the regular container images, as if you still had the fat images and you still have all of your tools in the shell in one place. It doesn't try to debug for you. So that's
mhm.
not in
Yeah.
scope. That's not the intent. You still need to know how to use the tools. You still need to know the right commands, debug commands. And like you said, there is an opportunity to have higher level tools, and a lot of them will be commercial tools, but I'm pretty sure some of them will be open source. Even Kate's GPT is sort of in that space where they analyze different parts of the Kubernetes environment, and then they try to make sense of the event logs and the error logs and all of that. They try to troubleshoot things for you. So
Right.
there is something in the open source
Yeah.
community, and there will be more, and LLMs will be used more for that.
Yeah. We've had a lot of those commercial troubleshooting in um, those kind of tools. Essentially, we've had those on the show for years. So if you're watching and you're like, what are all those tools? Well, I don't have all of them, but I have a lot of videos here on YouTube. So go back in the channel, look at the guests. We have a lot of Kubernetes. It feels like observability. We even just had one on this month. Observability, troubleshooting, monitoring, all those things. There's a whole ecosystem of tooling out there that's probably going to solve some of these problems for you, but it's nice. This is a pretty cool thing. And like you said, this is not Kubernetes specific. A lot of these things can be used across at least 3, if not 4 different runtimes. You can use it locally, you can use it remotely. We didn't even really go into like how it's connecting to the different servers, but I'm sure that you could just ask the AI that. We don't have to teach you everything about this tool. So what else? I know we want to talk a little bit about your new startup and maybe mention that. But
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if there's anything major left
I
in
won't.
your demo.
I won't spend. Well, before I get to it, so the debug command is awesome, and it's a part of the toolkit. That's the whole point of the name, MinToolkit, because it's more than just slimming, more than just debugging, more than just X-raying. It's a lot of different things. Ultimately, the goal there is to be the CLI and the app for all things containers, longer term goal. So that's what I want to use all the time. And that, as I add things, that's the intent, longer term intent for me, to use this as one tool as opposed to a bunch of different tools, regardless of runtime and all. And because multiple runtimes will be the norm going forward, and just with Docker and Kubernetes alone, you have that, and having that CLI that helps me interact with containers regardless of where they are, the environment and the runtime. That's kind of that's the intent behind the open source tool. If you
Hmm.
want a dedicated debugging tool for containers, I want to make sure I mention cdebug. Cdebug is something that Ivan Velichko created, and it's mentioned in that presentation, KubeCon presentation. He was supposed to be there, but because of the family reasons, he couldn't make it. He has awesome blogs and a set of labs, container, Kubernetes, and Docker and Linux learning labs that, if you want to know more, you can look at those and explore those. And he has the dedicated debug tool as well. The Podman support isn't quite there. The design is slightly different, but it's dedicated to container debugging specifically. So there's a lot of overlap, slightly different design and slightly different coverage in terms of the capabilities and the runtimes. But I want to make sure that that's also available for everybody in their tool chain. You pick the tools that make sense, easier to use, and it's always good to have more options because they may fit your flow and your use cases better. So
is this what we're talking about?
That's the labs, and then you can go to the GitHub project cdebug. So if you look for cdebug on GitHub, you'll be able to find it.
CD as it sounds, CDBUG.
C as in container, so container debug, but C.
Oh, debug. Got it. Yeah. See if I got it right.
There's no project, so that's probably not. Yeah, so it's under his username, and just if you search for cdebug, it on its own.
Yay. Google.
There's a link to it from the KubeCon slides that you shared.
Like that. There we go. Wow. Yep. Okay, here we go.
That's an awesome option as well.
Yeah, very cool. I didn't know about this. What we were talking about the other week, I use stars on GitHub to know when I've actually seen something. I don't actually use it for like if I like it or I've used it. I'm just like, okay, I've been here. I've marked my spot so that when I come back and I'm like, I don't remember this. Well, I've been here before. Weird habit, but that's what I do. This is really cool. I'm actually going to check this out.
Give it a try. And again, it's dedicated to debugging. It has other nice capabilities with port forwarding, which is its own thing with some of the runtimes, and in some runtimes it's trickier to do than in others and all. But
yeah, really cool. I don't know how to say it. Iximuse?
Nobody knows. I don't think I even know.
It's just a bunch of characters.
Yep. Exactly. So, but the new venture, again, using DockerSlim as the foundation because it has a lot of kind of conceptually a lot of valuable tech and the right approach, an application-centric approach. And the idea there is that imagine the world where you as a developer focus on the application, writing awesome applications, and then somebody else takes care of maintaining and managing your application. So that's the intent. Obviously, there's a lot to it, and the goal for the company is to focus on the application dependency security maintenance. That's a smaller slice. It's kind of the Amazon books moment, because Amazon didn't start like the company it is now. Obviously, they didn't have AWS from day one. They started with books. So you start small. So the intent is to do security maintenance for your application dependencies, because that's where you have vulnerabilities. It's the code you didn't write, but it's the code that can get you compromised. So you didn't write that code, you don't fully control it, and that's not your primary focus, but it's still important. So it's focusing on that, using DockerSlim as a foundation, and kind of goes towards full automation and more autonomous mode. That's why the name of the company is Autonomous Plane, because it's using autonomous agents. That's yeah, so that's the intent, and that's the starting point. But the long-term vision, it's a little crazy, but it's directional in general. And at the same time, you kind of need to be a little ambitious, because you shoot for the stars, and then you'll accomplish awesome things. But you got to start small, and something basic, and leveraging what's possible based on DockerSlim provides is a great starting point. And
Yeah.
yeah, DockerSlim is about application intelligence and the application-centric approach, and that's the way to accomplish those goals, security maintenance as well. So, yeah.
Nice. I'm looking forward to hearing more about it and seeing some videos and demos and stuff when it's sort of
Well, we get to
publicly
talk more
available.
AI, more different designs, designing autonomous agents. What is an autonomous agent, and what's not an autonomous agent?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's one of those things we were talking before the show where we had so much to talk about, and I know we're running long, but I felt like I knew it was going to be long because I wanted to get some demos in. I wanted to get some people like hands-on understanding of like this debug can be complex, but that your tool really does solve some of those complexity problems for people, so they don't have to think about it. I always felt like I had to have my own kit, and it would mean I had to have a bunch of notes about all these esoteric options I might have to use in kube control
exactly.
debug, or like I had all these notes about how to use nsenter, and I feel like I can kind of get rid of a lot of that and just
Yeah.
use the debug command, which I haven't really used in a real production setup yet. So I was excited to learn more, and you've mentioned it several times. I'm like, I know I need to spend some time on learning that.
Yeah, there will
Um,
be some advanced cases where you might still need to use an center when you need to
mhm.
accomplish certain things, low-level things at the node level in Kubernetes and all of that. I'm not saying that it's going to cover
It's not.
100% of
It's
the
not
use cases,
right. Good point.
but it's not meant to be. It's meant to cover kind of the 80/20 kind of thing. Make it
Right.
easy 80% of the time, because that's the whole point. Just because of the tricky 20% or 10%, your whole developer experience doesn't need to suffer. An S Center shouldn't have to be the tool to use to do all of those things.
And to remind people, this is also very much like we said earlier, very much why a lot of people try to go down that security, like they go hard into the security. This is a sort of like, if I can look at some of my past clients, and the tendency that they have is they get one engineer that gets really focused on security or excited about it with Docker and Kubernetes. And they keep learning more things that they can lock down and enable. And they learn about AppArmor and SE Linux and
Hmm.
SecComp, and they get super nerdy on this stuff, which is good. I super encourage that. And I do that same thing myself. But then they hit like reality hits when they go to production, and they're the only person that knows all this stuff, and now no one else can actually help. And I've seen it happen, and then they end up having to back off, and maybe like using back when we were all using the distroless images from Google, and you would have to put
Hmm.
the dev in the tag because you needed the shell, and you could never get to the true
Exactly.
distro list because people demanded it or expected a package manager, and expected a shell
Exactly.
in there, and then you had to, you sort of, if you so I've watched people sort of feel like they lost sort of an honorable fight by trying to implement tighter security because they didn't really know how to give everyone the right tools. And so I feel like this is one of those things where we can sort of shout from the rooftops of like, hey, you want to do all that? You better know some of these tools. Like maybe you got
Yeah.
a Docker debug command because you pay for Docker and you can use that. I have heard, I'm not sure if it's rumor or if they've even done it, but I have heard that they were going to add Kubernetes to them. I'm not sure if that's actually out yet,
I've
but they were
heard
going to.
I've heard about it as well, that they're working on it. I thought it was a
Yeah.
beta feature.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't.
Yeah.
I tried it. I played with it this week, and I couldn't see how to do Kubernetes in like the default built-in version.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna be. There's actually a Docker Captain Summit next weekend, not this week, next weekend, in Portugal. So I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot of
Nice.
things, that some things I can't say, and then a lot of things that are going to be about like what they're doing with Docker Desktop and some of the stuff that they're adding to Hub and Desktop, and just adding. I feel like Docker's on this tear of just adding a whole bunch of extra functionality around containers that's related. So
Yeah,
Uh,
one of the big challenges in general, you mentioned those engineers who get very excited by the advanced features, is that they're niche and advanced, and your average developer, the masses, don't necessarily know them and
yeah,
don't necessarily have an experience dealing with them. That's one of the gotchas. Now you're expecting others to be at the same
yeah,
level as you in terms of the expertise, and it's just not great.
yeah,
So yeah, yes, it's possible. Yes, it's there, but it shouldn't have to be the default for the average developer. So you need to find a way to make it work for the average developer. Otherwise, it's not going to be practical. So, and
yeah.
that's kind of the key idea behind this concept with DockerSlim debug. Make it approachable and usable by the average developer. Make it accessible to the masses. Not necessarily there isn't a better way to do it, a more advanced way to do it, but it is an easy way to do the most common things that you're used to. And in terms of advanced capabilities and features, we can talk about Sochi and eStarGZ and snapshotters if you're up for it.
Yeah, yeah. We put this in the list here. Oh, where was it?
Because you had Phil recently with Finch and all of that, so
Yeah.
it's related to those capabilities. If you're using if you want to use containerd directly, you're probably used to nerd control as the CLI. And when you're dealing with containerd, you have these capabilities that you can extend how you deal with different types of images, and you can introduce different file systems for the images. And Amazon introduced Sochi. Sochi is a way to have an index for your containers, and making it
Hmm.
easier to load the stuff that you need on demand. Because by default, the container images, they're optimized for the build flow. So what if you look at a container image, it's like a tree. I like the tree analogy. So
Hmm.
you have one layer and then you have another layer. It's like a tree that grows. You add more stuff, you have a new ring. You add more things, you have one more ring. And each layer is like a ring in a tree. So and that's based on how you build it, how you extend it. And what you really need, and I wish it was the case, but it's not, the images need to be run time centric. And that's what Sochi and eStarGZ and StarGZ try to accomplish. They make it possible for you to load the components of the container image that you need. It all started with the StarGZ um, idea from Google, and then it was extended to work with containerd with eStarGZ, where there's for each layer there's an index that's attached to the layer, and then and then when you load the container image, you can prefetch parts of each layer. There's a way to profile the container and then pick the things that you need first at the head of the container, and then those will be prefetched, so they're loaded on demand. But in general, with the index, what happens, there is an index that tells you where a specific file is located. And when your container runs, it says, I need to access this binary. And then the containerd runtime does a lookup. So I have this binary name. What's the block where this binary data lives? And then it makes a registry request to fetch a range of data for that block, and that block of data from the image, not the whole image layer, but only that block is fetched, so you can load that executable. Now, if you have an image that's 10 gigabytes, you're not loading the whole 10 gigabytes. You're only loading the things you need based on what your runtime requested. And it uses the fuse file system, and it does a callback into containerd, and the snapshotter is responsible for doing a registry lookup with that range data, and then the chunks are fetched, and that way you can start the container much faster. And Sochi was a way to do the same thing, but without mutating the container image. With StarGZ and eStarGZ, you need to rebuild the image so you have the index with each layer.
Right.
But that means you need to change the images. And with Sochi, you don't need to. You create the indexes as separate artifacts, and especially with the new OCI registry spec that supports other types of metadata, it's much easier to deal with. You still have the hacky way to get to it, but with special tags, but they use the referrer API and the tags as the fallback, and then you're loading container image X, and then it does a lookup. Is there any extra data for that container X? Yes, all the Sochi stuff, and then it pulls the Sochi indexes, and then again it uses the Sochi index to do lookups. It's a little different there because it also has to deal with gzip compression, and gzip compression it's not chunkable. You need to maintain state. So what they do with Sochi, they persist state checkpoints in the index as well. So with each chunk that you load, you also have the decompression state that you load. That way, you're able to access chunks in the middle of a zip compressed stream, because it's not you don't have random IO with gzip, unfortunately. So they use the hacky things like that there to make it random IO. But the overall goal is the same. You have those chunks, you can load them on demand. And in that talk that you mentioned, the slides that you showed, I actually wanted to see if it was possible to use that data to get the file information for minification, because that's one of the things DockerSlim does. It has different engines to get the telemetry, file telemetry about the container, and that's one of the more esoteric ways to get that telemetry, by observing what's being requested by container D. The main gotcha there is that it's not requesting the files themselves, it's requesting the ranges. So you need to map the ranges into the file names, and there's an extra step that happens. And technically it's possible with both of them. That was the goal of my experiment, to see if it was possible, but it's a little bit easier to do with eStarGZ because of how the chunks are structured. And it's more complicated with Sochi because they have to maintain the decompression state. And that's what the Amazon guys said. If you're going to make the chunks too small, the index is going to be big. So that's
Right.
one of the gotchas. So you'll sort of negate the purpose of having the index there, because the idea is to load a small image and all of that. But if you have an image that's you have an index that's bigger than the image, that's going to be tricky. But still, it's doable. So
Yeah, and this is actually a really good. I mean, I'm learning tons here. Like, I didn't actually understand really how the StarGZ pulled blocks from registries before, but I remember when, in fact, I had to go check because. So we're talking about this, and I just want to catch people up a little bit. If you didn't know, there's certain plugins that you can work with Containerd on. By default, Containerd just does normal stuff like we all know Docker does, and now Containerd does it for Kubernetes, and there's plugins in it, and one of them you can do lots of things. You can do encrypted image storage. There's all sorts of cool stuff, and I think they have an image somewhere where they show all these different things that you can connect to it. But one of them was StarGZ. I can't remember when this first came out, like, I don't know, 4 something years ago, at least that. I mean, but I've never actually used this in the real world. But I was lazy loading. The idea of lazy loading containers was just like, when it first came out, I was like, this is science fiction. Like, this isn't a real thing. Like, this is imagine someone's faking data and like pretending that there's not stuff stored on the hard drive or something.
exactly.
But this is science. Like, it's actually pretty cool stuff. So to hear you talk about it, and then pointing out some of the problems, I guess, that you're having with Slim and these kind of things is
And So with Sochi, if you're using the Amazon services, then you get Sochi snapshotter configured by default. So you
Mm.
don't even need to customize containerd. And with your Kubernetes cluster, you can configure your nodes where you can configure custom snapshotters. And snapshotters, they're responsible for file system snapshots. I think it's an odd name, but it sort of makes sense.
Hmm.
Yeah, there are different ways to represent the file systems in containers, and snapshotters are responsible for dealing with different types of file systems, how they're structured. And so they have those plugins that you can configure. Sochi, configured by default if you're using Amazon services, container services, and then eStarGZ, you have to configure that explicitly. And again, if you're creating your own Kubernetes cluster, you configure your nodes, and yeah, for example, there's a kind container image node container image config with eStarGZ, uh, so you can use something pre-configured if you want to give it a try. But you don't get them by default if you're doing your own thing. So
Yeah.
that's one of the gotchas.
Yeah. And this is all like, uh, again, for those listening, this is not day one container stuff.
No, 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 no.
In
It's one of
fact,
those more advanced capabilities, but it's an interesting
yeah.
construct. Lazy loading. There are other options that exist. Those two are just the most common options.
I wish I had this. There was probably a good project. I had a couple of projects like in 2018 timeline of traditional monolith apps that were multi-gig, like Ruby apps, and there's probably a Node.js app in there or a Python app, but they would just had, they had fat images, system dependencies from the system package manager. Then they were probably like front. I think because they were monoliths. They were basically everything all in one. So they had the front end, which means they needed npm even if they weren't a Node.js app. And so the
Yep.
Docker file was 200 lines long, right, to get this
Mhm.
whole monolith thing built, and minified CSS and just all the things that this thing did. And it was, I think we were able to get it down below 2 gig, but that was about as good as we can get. And chances are it didn't need most of those files a lot of the time. So lazy loading could have really, I think, helped them. It's
Exactly.
interesting to consider, like, even just using it for local development. Maybe I've never really played around with it, so I don't know if there's a potential for like savings there. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's an interesting concept.
With both of them, they still load the rest of the container image. So they both of them have this feature to do background prefetching. So that's one of the things that I had to disable, because if I don't disable that, then all files, all blocks will be fetched, and then I won't get the information
Yeah, you
about
won't
the
get the
stuff
event.
that's needed. So I had to disable prefetching, but it's if you don't care about that kind of information that I was trying to get, it's not a big deal. So there's extra flags I had to configure, but most people don't need to care. But one of the goals is to also produce eStarGZ images as opposed to Slim images. So that way you can say, okay, I want an image that loads faster. I still want to keep the rest of it, but I want it to load faster. And it's also an intermediate state towards minified images to
Right.
make sure you're not missing anything, because in some cases it might be a little trickier to accomplish. And like I mentioned with eStarGZ, there's a way to put more relevant files to the at the top of the layer, and then there is a marker that tells you, okay, everything before that marker needs to be prefetched, and the rest of it can be lazy loaded later on
Mm.
demand, or background fetched. So what DockerSlim can do technically, um, and if somebody can contribute, we can get that sooner. It can create those eStarGZ images with the profile information based on its observations. So it can leverage the data that it collects, and it generates those eStarGZ images with the prefetch sections populated, and then you'll get the images that load faster without losing any files at all. So that's one of the features on the wish list. And if anybody wants to participate and contribute, it's a good opportunity there as well.
Very cool. I think my first time wishing I think I had lazy loading was when you have those 2 gig images and they're maybe on the other side of the planet from you, because you're not using Docker Hub and you're maybe using something that's in a single data center. With Kubernetes, because it's asynchronous or declarative, you do an apply and then you don't realize that it's downloading an image for 5 minutes. And so you're sitting there wondering what's happening, what's going on, what is it doing?
Exactly.
The servers must be slow. And it's not easy to see network bandwidth caps inside of a server that is in the cloud that you don't have maybe a shell to or whatever. So
Exactly.
I feel like there were those learning moments where I was like, okay, this is a big image. We all got to give it minutes to load, and that we could have really used that in those particular projects I was working on. So
And it makes
cool
a
stuff.
difference. It's not
Yeah.
voodoo magic. In the demo I did, it's like the regular image would load half a minute, and a lazy loaded image would start immediately,
Mm.
and it would be up and running. Huge
Yeah.
difference.
It almost reminds me, remember we used to defragment hard drives back in the day when we had spinning disks,
Yeah.
and we would organize all of the data that was important to, I think it was maybe the outside of the, if you got a really fancy one, it would actually move things to the faster part of the disk spinning because anyway, I'm an old nerd. It kind of reminds me of that a little bit. And
Exactly that.
yeah. So just for the internet, a little different, nothing to do with hard drives, but this has been awesome. I mean, I feel like we could do this for another 3 hours, but we both probably need a refill on a drink or a bio break or something like that.
Yep.
So thanks so much, Kyle, for being here. This was a lot of fun. My team was going to have a lot of fun trying to figure out how to make this into a podcast without all the demos. So I tried to add. I tried to talk whenever you were demoing about what we were doing so that it would make good for Christy. Sorry, Christy. You're going to have to figure that out. So I'm looking forward to autonomous plane and like hearing what you're going to do with that. So in case you didn't, if you want to follow Kyle, what's your Twitter handle? I forgot. Or your X handle now, I guess.
KCQ on.
KCQ on. So for these who want to follow him, I'll throw up his, he's pretty active on Twitter. I see you talking with Dagger people and other community members.
If anybody is interested in doing a session on kind of exploring the AI tools in the DevOps space, we can do a kind of a design review of the different tools to kind of look at the magic inside, including Kate's GPT, etc. So what's the magic? How does it work? What does it do? There's a number of nice tools, and I think it can be helpful. But I'm up for doing something like that and talk about agents, etc. Later on. So just a thought.
Yeah, and for those of you watching, I mean, I find Kyle very approachable. Like he will. I'm not going to promise for you, but he will probably reply to you on Twitter if you reach out to him. Especially if you're looking to help with the project. You also have a Discord server, right? Like you have Discord. There's the discussions on GitHub. Like if you're interested in these tools, there's lots of places that Kyle's provided to the community to go find that stuff. I'm looking forward to hearing that on updates. So Kyle's giving you like half a dozen reasons to go help out with the community around Mint, and I'm looking forward to
lots of new features on the wish list.
Yeah,
and if you want to contribute, that'll be great. We got a couple of contributors in the latest release. It's good to see more.
Yeah, where's the wish list? Is it on the README, or do you use like GitHub projects for that, or?
It's a combination. There's a roadmap MD file. There is a set of GitHub issues, and there's just stuff that's floating around discussions.
Okay, in the repo.
I think the eStarGZ capability, image capability, that's not captured everywhere. So it was kind of ad hoc, mentioned in the conference presentation. So a few of those things are still kind of in the air.
Yeah. Well, great. We're going to do this again, soon. whenever that is. You know, all you on the internet that watch me, you know, I say soon all the time. That means somewhere in between now and infinity is soon. And yeah, it'll be great to hang out again and catch up. Maybe next time we're gonna have Normal with us because he's gonna miss out. I'm gonna have to tell him when I see him in a couple of weeks, like, hey man, you missed out on a great show. But he was gone this week, so we will have him back next week. Actually, in case you didn't know, next week is Traffic. We're having the founder of Traffic on the show to talk all about Traffic 3.0, the migration plan. How do you get from your version 2 to 3? Because they've been working on 3 for years. What's new, the gateway API, the WASM support. There's all kinds of things. We're going to be getting all of that next week. We're just emailing back and forth this morning trying to figure out the list, and the list is long of things we want to talk about, kind of like with Kyle this week. So it may be a longer show than normal, but I'm a big fan of Traffic. I know a lot of you in the community are big fans of that, so I wanted to get them on the show. So I'm excited that the founder and CTO is coming on. Nirmal and I will also be doing a Q&A the week after that. So we'll have one of those general just hanging out shows. And then we're going to do ML Ops, which is more important nowadays than ever. So if you're not someone who's in the machine learning and operating those in Kubernetes clusters, we're going to get some experts on the show. It's probably not the last time we're going to do it. We're going to have people on talking about not the jets flying overhead, but talking about ML Ops in Kubernetes and containers specifically. And then we've got a whole bunch more guests coming this summer. So please stay tuned. Come back on Thursdays. Listen to the podcast. We'll see you soon, everybody. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.